Our guests for this Hertog conversation are Admiral Gary Roughead and Ambassador Eric Edelman. In 2018, Ambassador Edelman and Admiral Roughead co-chaired the congressionally mandated National Defense Strategy Commission. Our point of departure for this conversation is the report from that commission.
Your mandate from Congress was to evaluate the Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy. Your main finding was that the DoD got the strategy right, particularly its emphasis on great power competition with China, but that we are not adequately resourcing defense budgets to execute that strategy. Now, one common argument is that the U.S. already spends some $700 billion on national defense, far more than our allies or our rivals, including China. Why do we spend so much on defense? And why isn't our current budget sufficient to our aims?
Well, first, let me just say thank you to Cheryl, Mary Elizabeth, and Sydney for organizing this event. It's always great to be with the Hertog Foundation. And it's really good to be reunited with my colleague, my co-conspirator on the National Defense Strategy Commission, my partner in co-chairing it, and my friend, Admiral Gary Roughead. I had the privilege of serving in the Pentagon as Undersecretary of Defense when he was the Chief of Naval Operations. He was a great CNO, and he's a national treasure, continuing to offer a lot of counsel to his successors and the successive secretaries of the Navy and others in support of our national defense. So why do we spend so much on national defense, and why do we feel that it's important to maintain high level of defense spending? And Admiral Roughead and I actually had a chance to talk with Secretary Esper last week about precisely this question, and I think it's fair to say, without quoting him, that he too keenly feels the need to maintain sufficient funding for defense in order to execute the national defense strategy. First, we remain the preeminent global military power in the world, with global reach and forward presence in East Asia, in Europe, two areas of the world where we have maintained a stable balance of power since the end of World War II, as well as the Middle East, where we've been heavily engaged for the last 30 years. Second, unlike some of our great power competitors, we have a professional military that is highly paid and compensated. And those personnel costs consume an increasing share of our budget, particularly when you add to them healthcare costs, which are rising very rapidly. And the healthcare costs inside the military budget are, in some sense, a microcosm of the larger problem we have with entitlement spending in the federal budget for Medicare and Medicaid, et cetera. So there are some very important reasons why our budget is so high. Moreover, for essentially the last 20 years, we have been engaged in counterinsurgency, counterterrorist, and stabilization operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. And those operations have been extremely expensive. They have consumed a lot of capital equipment. We took a procurement holiday in the 1990s after the Cold War ended. It was a sort of peace dividend, and as a result, we have consumed an enormous amount of materiel that was built up during the Carter-Reagan defense buildup of the late 1970s, early 1980s. And we now face a different set of challenges of higher end competitors who have been steadily investing in defense and who have, I would say, a home court advantage in their respective theaters, whether it's Eastern Europe in the case of Russia or the Indo-Pacific area in the case of the People's Republic of China. And so we have to face the tyranny of distance and have to be able to project military power into those theaters in order to continue playing the balancing role that we have. That balancing role, I would submit, has actually enabled China's peaceful rise, has enabled the emergence of a Europe that is whole and free and has had a remarkable run of prosperity over the last 40 or 50 years. And if we want to continue to play that kind of role in the world, it will cost money to do it. And we can go on into greater detail about what levels and why. But I think that's the general outline of the argument I would make, and I defer to my partner and colleague.
Yeah. Well, again, it's great to be reunited with Eric. We've talked on a couple of occasions, but it was really a pleasure to be co-leading the commission with him. Just a couple points I'd like to make about it. One is that if you had been in the room with us over the months of our deliberation, you would not be able to determine who was nominated by the Democrats or the Republicans. And I think that just speaks to Eric's leadership and to the focus that our team had on it. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Hertog Foundation for bringing together such terrific young people who have an interest in our country, our national security, and in the world. Just a couple things that I mentioned. Agree completely with what Eric said regarding the cost. I think when people talk about the defense budget, that big number just is a stunner to anyone that looks at it. And it's so important to decompose that budget into how much are we spending on people. And as Eric mentioned, a lot of that, are what I call the internal entitlements of the military. Unlike a lot of those costs that we are kicking out to, your children and grandchildren, a lot of that has to be absorbed into the current budgets. And so I think it's important to look at when we have the all-volunteer force, and I think we'll come around to this later, that all-volunteer force, the cost of it is coming home to roost. And I think that's a topic of discussion for later on. It's also important, and Eric mentioned this, that, as we are out and about with a global perspective and global responsibilities to our allies. And I'll speak from the Navy standpoint, but the other services are exactly in the same boat. If I wanted to have a ship in the Middle East, I needed to have 4 ships to make one, because there's one there's one that's coming back, there's one that's getting ready to go, and then there's another one that's in deep maintenance. So that's, 4 to make one in the Middle East. You want a ship in the Far East, that's 4 to make one to get there. And so, because we have these global responsibilities, because we have to maintain the capabilities, and we also owe it to our men and women who serve that, they don't go out and stay at sea for 3 years. Those are factors that come into play. I would also tell you, and one of the great budget challenges that the nation is going to be facing here over the coming decade or decades is the cost of maintaining the security, the safety, and the surety of our strategic deterrent. That is a big deal. So, I think it's important, as you all look at what really goes into the cost of defense, to take and look at that decomposition of the budget.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our next question is on U.S. debt, which is currently exploding because of the coronavirus. Cheryl's old boss, Gary Schmidt, another defense budget expert, has rather gloomily predicted that this will put even more pressure on defense budgets. And so Beijing will actually end up deriving a strategic benefit from the pandemic. What effect do you think the pandemic and the attendant economic crisis will have on defense budgets? And how might we forestall Gary Schmidt's gloomy prediction?
Well, unfortunately, I'm inclined to agree with Gary that the amounts of money that are being appropriated by the Congress now, and the Congress is just taking up, today another a bill that's likely to be at least $1 trillion of additional federal spending, is going to drive a lot of discussion about um, cutting the defense budget because of the burden that the spending is putting on the long-term debt, of the United States. And you already see this playing out, and you see it playing out both on the left and on the right. So there's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, but now on both the left and the right, you're seeing arguments coming from both the left wing of the Democratic Party in the form of Senator Sanders, who's called for a 10% across the board cut in the defense budget, but also from the Cato Institute and the Koch brothers for defunding defense. And I do think that that needs to be resisted. Part of it is, I think, requirement that those members of Congress who are deeply knowledgeable, and unfortunately that's a shrinking number of members. The ranking Republican, for instance, on the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, is retiring this year. Even though his likely replacement is a former Navy doctor, I don't think he's actually going to bring the same level of knowledge to this job as Mac Thornberry. I think elected representatives are going to have to play an important role here in describing this to the public. And I think Secretary Esper and Chairman Milley are going to bear an enormous burden of trying to explain some of what Admiral Roughead and I were talking about earlier. That there are reasons why the budget is the way it is, and there are reasons why it needs to stay high. I mean, despite the pandemic, the challenge from near peer competitors like Russia and China is not going away because of the pandemic. I mean, one can speculate about whether China is going to, emerge from this with some damage to its international standing. Russia's demographics are already pretty terrible, and the pandemic is likely to exacerbate them. But they're not going away, and the challenges they represent are not going away. And we assessed in a totally bipartisan manner, as Admiral Roughead noted, that the older strategy of President Obama in the Defense Strategic Guidance of 2012, already to execute that strategy, the then Secretary of Defense and Chairman General Dunford and Secretary Mattis testified that it would take 3 to 5% annual real growth just to actually fund what we needed to execute that strategy, because the national defense strategy that was adopted in 2018, which I think we generally believe is the right direction to face the challenges that we are encountering, is more ambitious. It stands to reason that 3 to 5% is basically something of a floor, not a ceiling for what we ought to be spending. We're not going to come close to that, but I think we need to try and staunch the bleeding if we possibly can.
And what I would, and I think that this is where the political leadership needs to come in, is where do you want that money to come from? Because as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, for the Navy at least, it was in 2014 we crossed the line of paying more for people who have served in our Navy than we were currently paying for people that were in the Navy at that point in time. So, those are the entitlements that I talked about. So if you want to take money away, where do you go to get it? And I think that's a discussion that needs to take place. I would also argue that, and this is probably a bridge too far, but in reshaping where the forces are apportioned, there needs to be greater flexibility on the part of the representatives. For example, if you want to emphasize China and the Western Pacific more, one would argue, well, then if you have a finite Navy, move some of that Navy or move more of it to the West Coast. I still have the scars of trying to move a ship from the northern part of the East Coast to the southern part of the East Coast. So, this is, as I said, I think that on the budget side, things are coming home to roost, and people need to look at flexibility and the strategy and the concepts, the operational concepts that are going to make us or allow us to do more with a smaller force.
Great, thanks.
Elizabeth, can I just add one thing? Because Admiral Roughead, in his earlier comment, talked about the importance of our strategic deterrent. And one of the things that worries me about the current debate is you already see some of the folks who are calling for defense budget cuts focusing on our nuclear forces, particularly the land-based missile force. But I think it would be a huge mistake to focus on the nuclear side of the equation. First of all, although we've got a major modernization ongoing, which is sometimes referred to by critics as the $1 trillion triad, this is a $1 trillion investment that is essentially being amortized over 30 years. So at no point does it really exceed 7% of the defense budget in prospect. But moreover, it's really the fundament of our ability to operate as a global power. And there's some technical intricacies about why I don't think we would want to reduce the size of that force, particularly while we're trying to engage in arms control negotiations with both Russia and hopefully prospectively at some point China. But that is one place where people are starting, and I think that's looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. I agree with Admiral Roughead. What we really need to be focusing on is operational concepts that allow us to essentially try and do more with less.
Very much in that vein, I have a question for you about focus. Some defense experts argue that the way out of our current predicament is technology. Right now, the military spends a lot of money on maintaining and modernizing legacy equipment, manned aircraft or large aircraft carriers. And instead, they argue we need to shift to smaller, unmanned, less expensive platforms like cyber and AI. What do you think? A leaner, more technologically advanced military, is that the answer?
If you don't mind, Eric, I'll start with that.
Please, I was going to defer to you anyway, Gary.
This has been a discussion that's taken place in one form or another, probably since steam replaced sail and airplanes entered the argument. There's no question in my mind that there is a lot of cultural inertia to oppose the advent of some of these new capabilities. But I think it's so important that when it's very easy for things like cyber and autonomy to roll off the tongue, this is where our report was calling for what are the operational concepts that will employ those new technologies. Recently, there has been a discussion largely started by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Michelle Flournoy has picked up on the same thing of this more distributed force, which I think is a terrific idea. But what is the concept that supports that force? So let's take, for example, in the Western Pacific, if you distribute the force, how do you supply it? How do you connect it? How do you repair it? And those are things that are not being discussed that need to be part of the broader discussion of the introduction of new technologies and how, when, and what's their appropriate use. I think this is going to heat up because one of the concerns I have, and Eric and I have not talked to this since since we did our report, but in the financial crisis in 2008, China really stimulated things with a lot of infrastructure development. And I can't help but think that what we might see in China as they stimulate coming out of their COVID issues, will they stimulate into the new technologies, into 5G, into autonomy? And I think we need to watch that because they really, I think, could accelerate. The other thing that I think is important to watch with China, they were one of the largest commercial shipbuilders in the world. As that market depresses, they're not going to lay off a bunch of shipbuilders for their own internal political concerns. So will that divert, and will they actually increase the size of the Navy and use that to stimulate employment and their economy? So I think those are some things to watch. But again, my point is, what are the concepts? What's the deterrent value of some of these new technologies? And what do others think of us fielding those technologies? Does it reassure them, or does it cause them more concern?
Yeah, I would only add to that two observations. One, there's no question that China is investing in a range of technologies, and we do have to, as Admiral Roughead said, keep an eye on what they're doing. And there's a list of 10 key areas that former Undersecretary for Defense Development, Research, and Engineering, Michael Griffin, sent to industry a couple of years ago while we were writing our report, which we highlighted in the report. It's things like microelectronics, quantum computing and communications, AI, missile defense, space, nuclear, nanotechnology. There's a whole suite of technologies. But I don't think we should, well, we need to do that. And we certainly need to, try and divest some legacy equipment and bring on new capabilities. I mean, again, to repeat what Admiral Roughead said, unless you have a concept for how you're going to use them, it's interesting, but not really a solution to your problem. And I don't think we should think that there's going to be there's a tendency, I think, for some people to think that there's some technological magic bullet. Either it's autonomy, or it's AI, or it's something else. There won't be a magic bullet, and there will be nothing that will replace the work of human minds trying to figure out how to bring all of these different technologies to bear to get a particular outcome, and in particular to strengthen our ability to deter both of the great power adversaries as well as some of the lesser challenges that we face, like North Korea and Iran, et cetera. And when I say lesser, I don't mean that they're not serious challenges. They are, but they're just not at the same level as these near peer challenges.
I think one of the other aspects of some of the new technologies, and again, this is the concepts and the assessment of what's important to us as a country, but on a lot of the new technologies, I'm still scratching my head on how are they employed in soft power. In times of crisis, not necessarily in conflict, but I go back in my career, for example, to the tsunami of 2004 in South and Southeast Asia. Everyone said that we did such a good job and we were fast. We were fast because we were there, and we were there with things that could be repurposed to go in and alleviate a lot of the suffering that was taking place. So, that's another question that we have to ask ourselves is, it's not all about going in and, bombing a nation's capital. It really is, what's the face of the nation and how do we present ourselves? And I think we've kind of lost sight of that here recently.
Okay, thank you. And now I have a question that I might regret asking. Of all the threats that the U.S. faces, what's the nightmare scenario that keeps you both up at night?
Well, Admiral Roughead and I have actually not consulted on this, so I can't claim to have any insight into his nightmares. But I will say that one that worries me quite a bit is the prospect that deterrence breaks down with one or another of our great power competitors, and the other jumps in to take advantage of our being otherwise engaged with one of the other near peers. In our deliberations, one of the problems that I think we surfaced in the National Defense Strategy was that it is not really intended to deal with simultaneous conflict with more than one near peer competitor. And that would, I think, require a level of mobilization by the nation that we haven't really seen since perhaps the Korean War. And I don't think the American public is prepared for the level of violence and the scale of casualties we're likely to see in a conflict like that with either Russia or the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, I would say that I'll talk about two scenarios. One is a really bad one, and the other is the nightmare. And the really bad one is the stature and the global standing of the United States if China were to move on Taiwan. The American public is not ready for that discussion. And our ability and readiness to move, the importance that we as a nation place on supporting that democracy, I think is something that I worry about, because I do think that China is on a much more aggressive path. And we talk a lot about the South China Sea. Interesting, important. Taiwan is where we will be perceived as standing by our friends and allies in an important part of the world, or not. The nightmare scenario for me, and we seem to have not talked about it enough, is that there are countries, to include the major powers, that have nuclear weapons. And the destructive nature of those weapons is something that I think has been lost on so many. And a breakdown in the command and control, an inadvertent exchange. I still worry about India and Pakistan. To listen to them talk about their nuclear arsenals takes me back decades, and quite frankly makes my palms sweat. So nuclear exchange to me is the true nightmare scenario, the consequences of which we no longer seem to talk about.
One point just I think worth pausing on in Admiral Roughead's comments is about Taiwan, and that is that it highlights, I think, why what's going on in Hong Kong is so important right now, because this is fundamentally an issue of the People's Republic of China not abiding by an agreement it reached with Britain in the 1980s about the return of Hong Kong to Chinese control, and the creation of the system of one country with two systems, and respecting the independence and the liberties of the population of Hong Kong. And so it raises the prospect that the PRC at some point will be tempted to pursue not peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but forcible reunification with Taiwan. And I agree with Admiral Roughead. I don't think the American public is ready for that. We don't have a treaty obligation to defend Taiwan as we did before relations with the People's Republic were normalized in the late 70s. That treaty was abrogated. That 1954 treaty relationship was abrogated. But we do have some responsibilities under US law, under the Taiwan Relations Act, to help Taiwan defend itself. And even there, I'm not sure the public is ready for that discussion in terms of what that might entail. But even if we don't have an actual treaty obligation, I think were the PRC to forcibly reintegrate Taiwan into China without the United States taking pretty serious action against the PRC, I think the entire fabric of our system of alliances in Asia and beyond would be shaken to its core.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to our students now. We have questions from 3 of our political studies fellows. And the first one up is Zane Zovak of Baylor University, who I believe has a question about a similar topic.
All right. Well, thank you both for spending some time with us and for the work you did going over the national defense strategy. I was hoping to ask for both of your thoughts on how the U.S. can better respond to gray zone aggression from foreign actors without escalating to without escalating the conflict to the point of war. And is this a question again of lacking resources, or do we need to rethink our strategic approach to these sorts of things? Thanks.
I'll go ahead and start, Eric. No, Zane, you're really homing in on a really good point, and I think that we spent a fair amount of time during the commission's work to talk about the gray zone, to talk about the need for better national coordination economically and through policy on how do we deal with the pushes and the pulls. How do we synchronize the actions, reactions on our side? And I think that, all too often, folks are saying, well, the gray zones are a problem. DOD, what should we do about it? And this is really it has to occur at a higher level. Using the South China Sea as a case in point, my sense is that we should have, as soon as China started to destroy that very fragile ecosystem down there, we should have mobilized environmental arguments. We should have brought in other countries, and to not only talk about it from a legal standpoint and a security standpoint, but also an environmental irresponsibility on the part of China. How do you play that, and then how do you put it in the informational space that can make the public more aware of that? I also think that, for example, when the tribunal ruled in the case of the South China Sea, there should have been a very rapid and coordinated move on the part of the United States to go to other countries in the region that have competing claims and say, look, this ruling has come out. Why don't we get you to come up with reasonable solutions that then I think would have been a greater pushback onto China. So again, but that has to happen and it has to be synchronized. And Eric is much more familiar with interagency than I am, so I defer to him.
Well, I do think that the problem with the gray zone is that the problem gets dumped at the doorstep of the Department of Defense when in fact it really is a whole of government problem. And the government is not really, organized, to deal with many of these issues. I mean, one of the contributions, I think, of our commission report was that we tried to point out that although there's been a certain amount of attention to the activities in the so-called geographic gray zones, and as Admiral Roughead has pointed out, they're not just zones, they're whole regions that are gray, if you will, where our adversaries are taking small incremental actions that are clearly being both timed and phased in a way that puts them below the threshold that we would have for any kind of military response. But you find yourself in the position of the frog who's being boiled. And so in the South China Sea example that Admiral Roughead used, should you blow up Chinese missile installations when they put them on, they put their HQ-9 missiles on Woody Island in the South China Sea? Well, that would seem pretty provocative, a little bit sporty. Well, what about the second island? Well, how about when they've got 100 of these things militarized and now they declare a defense information zone, and so you can't fly or sail through the area anymore. So it's trying to keep yourself from facing that kind of situation. I think that we need to organize the government a little bit better. We didn't take this on in the commission, but the last time we had a major governmental reorganization was the National Security Act of 1947. And it may be that we need to relook at that, about how we're organized. in order to meet some of these challenges. In particular, because as we, I think, said in the report, it's not just a geographic challenge, it's also a functional challenge. I mean, and it's not just competition. I mean, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy talk about competition with our competitors, our near peer competitors, that the reality is in the gray zone, both geographic and particularly functional, and by which I mean information, cyber, et cetera. We're in conflict with them every day. I mean, in cyber, our systems are under attack by both Russia and China every day. And so we need to, see whether, I think we really need to examine whether we need to organize ourselves in a different way. And not only our effort, with regard to national defense strategy, but the Cyber Solarium Commission and Congress created, among others, have been looking at some of these same issues.
I would also add that there's a budget dimension to this as well. I think as long as each department or agency sees themselves challenged in the functional areas, as Eric pointed out, they're going to create solutions. And the question I have is, one, will we be spending more money on multiple solutions when an integrated one would be better? And then how well do those stovepipes interact with one another is the next question. So I completely agree with Eric. We haven't had a good look at national security really since 1947, and I think that time is now, and it really needs to be led. I think leaders in Congress need to come together and with the executive branch and really take a look at it, because the world has changed so much at a faster rate than any other time in history, and I think it's time to do a relook.
Thanks, Zane.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Our next student questioner is Miriam Waba of Fordham University. Miriam, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Great. Ambassador, Admiral, thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you both. And my question is something that you touched on very briefly. So the current administration promotes an America First foreign policy. And this has meant withdrawing from some regions and conflicts, such as pulling out of Syria and abandoning our allies, the Kurds. Is there a way to reconcile the competing ideas of America First and American leadership and military superiority? Simply what I'm trying to ask is, how would you make the argument against scaling back our military commitments, given the increased international tensions and direct threats?
Eric, I think you're muted.
I am. I'm sorry. My wife says I sound better that way. I think the term America First has a very unfortunate, genealogy. It's really rooted in the interwar years and in the effort by Charles Lindbergh and Father Coughlin and others to keep the United States from entering the European War and from playing a global role. In fact, I mean, it was premised on the notion that the United States could adhere to a concept of kind of hemispheric defense, that we could somehow keep the hemisphere safe even while the rest of the globe was burning. That notion was frankly discredited during World War II, and although it had lingering afterlife in some quarters in the Republican Party in the 1940s, after 1952, it really kind of disappeared as a current in American political life and thought. And I think it's incompatible, in my view, Miriam, with the United States actually playing a global role. I mean, what many people who had actually been involved in defense planning before World War II, who believed in the idea of hemispheric defense, Fortress America, gave that up and began to understand that America's defense had to be premised on the ability to project power and to defend forward. that if we didn't maintain a balance of power in Europe and in East Asia, in the great industrial heartlands of the modernized, industrialized world, the potential consequences for the United States, both economically and politically, were incalculable. I still think that's true. And I think actually one reason why we're seeing more conflict is a perception that the United States is pulling back and that it's not willing to defend its allies in extremis. And I think that creates a potential for opportunistic aggression by our adversaries and by other forces that don't that are, I would say, are not benign forces. I mean, when the United States pulls back and creates a vacuum, it is not filled by responsible stakeholders, to coin a phrase, who are interested in maintaining a just global order. It tends to be filled by predatory actors, whether state or non-state, who have very little compunction about inflicting enormous horrors on other people. And we've seen that in Syria. We're seeing it now going on in Libya. And I think it's also true in East Asia and in Europe.
I think one of the things that is important, and this is where political leadership, I think, needs to talk about those parts of the world that are of significant interest to our security and our prosperity. You know, we touched on Taiwan earlier. I mean, the debate and discussion about Taiwan is just, not taking place. And for fear of sounding like a dinosaur, if you go back to one of FDR's fireside chats where he told everybody to get out their atlas so that he could talk about things that were happening in the world. I think, that may sound simplistic, but we no longer have those types of conversations. We tend to have a conversation after things have gone south, but, I really do believe that there needs to be leadership talking about the importance of these various areas around the world that are key to our security.
I mean, nothing, it seems to me, could be, more indicative of the irreducible interconnectedness of the world than the moment we're living through right now. I mean, obviously, the pandemic knows no borders, obviously. And so something that happens in the remote part of the People's Republic of China within a matter of months is wreaking havoc, here in the United States, both in terms of public health, but also economics. And it's slowed down international travel, but international travel will return, and it continues to bring with it all sorts of other consequences. And the idea that we're going to somehow turn the clock back and exist in a mid 20th century world where the United States can, say, the devil take the hindmost, we're going to just pursue our own, interest here at home and have nothing to do with the rest of the world. It's just an illusion.
Thank you both.
Our last political studies fellow with her question is Grace Van Jones from St. John's College.
Hi, thank you for letting me ask a question. I want to come back to something that was touched on a bit earlier, which is that the pool of candidates that is fit for sophisticated military service is decreasing. And it seems to me that this issue touches on a paradox that's sort of inherent in the kind of democracy that we live in the United States. On one hand, all of the citizens of the US deserve and expect to have their safety guaranteed, whether or not their individual vocations is to formally protect the nation. But on the other hand, this freedom to follow any vocation of one's choosing is only guaranteed by those who choose to dedicate their lives to our national security. What are some of the ways that we can increase the pool of candidates who are both fit for this kind of military service and also compelled personally to follow it?
Yeah, great question, Grace. And this has been a focus area of mine for some time because, I think we need to look at how can people in this country serve in the national security space, and what should the design of that model be? And my interest was piqued on this, particularly in some of the functional areas that Eric talked about, especially in cyber. And I think that we have to relook, and this is why I think this review of our national security is so important, is relook at what the models are and how people can serve. Now, I think that there will always be the requirement for people to put on a uniform and go in harm's way and physically go in harm's way. But, for example, can you create a civilian reserve force, for example, in cyber? Patriotic Americans who have particular skills, who don't necessarily want to be able to demonstrate that they can run a 5-minute mile every 6 months, to be part of the active military, but whose talents and skill are there. And one of the last things I did while I was on active duty was get a pilot program approved for what was called a civilian cyber reserve, where we went out to companies and said, hey, we want to tap into some of this talent. I think it's also important because in a lot of those technologies, that technology is going to change very, very quickly. And so rather than take someone and try to keep them up to speed with regard to those changing technologies, if I can have a system where I can reach in and tap into the brightest minds in that particular moment in time, to me, that's a better model. So I really do think that, the time is right. That's why I enjoy talking to all of you and your colleagues, because you're the ones that are going to, this is your world that you're going to be leading us into. And so how do you reshape the nature of the national security force, I'll call it that, in a way that meets the challenges of the future? And so I would encourage you to keep thinking about that. And this is hard stuff because there are entrenched interests, there are costs associated with it. There's the cultural inertia that you have to overcome within the current organizations. But it needs to be taken on because, as I said, the all-volunteer force has come home to roost, and we need to come up with a different model.
Well, I certainly agree with what Admiral Roughead just said. In fact, he and I served on another commission that looked at the force of the future that dealt with many of the issues that Admiral Roughead just talked about. But moving beyond the all-volunteer force that represents our military, as Admiral Roughead and I have been discussing, a lot of our national security depends on a broader conception that includes other elements of national power, whether it's our diplomatic corps, our intelligence community, et cetera, or professionals in our Treasury Department who also play an important part in counterterrorist finance or in sanctions, which are an important tool of U.S. national security as well. And I think, one of the things that I think is very destructive that's happened over the last several years is the diminution and derogation of public service, and particularly the idea that somehow people in these fields are part of a deep state. I mean, I feel that particularly keenly because I was ambassador to a country that actually had a deep state, and which actually from whence the term deep state emerges. It didn't come out of the mind of Steve Bannon. It came out of the Turkish experience of illicit relationships between the judiciary, the police, and the military. There is no deep state in America, and what's happened to some of my former colleagues in the Department of State, what's happened to colleagues who were on the NSC staff, I think has done enormous damage to the idea of public service and people's willingness to entertain the idea. I think it's still very important. I think there's been enormous damage done over the last several years, not just in this administration. It began earlier, but to the diplomatic service, which now has been really hollowed out. I mean, we talked about the hollow military of the 1970s. We have a very hollow diplomatic service, not because people like me have retired, because I'm well past the age of mandatory retirement for the Foreign Service, but the folks in the 50 to 65 period have either been forced out or fled en masse. And that means that you as a taxpayer are not getting the full benefit of 20 to 25 years of effort and training and expenditure that's gone into making those people ready to take on the most senior assignments in the diplomatic service, be that as an ambassador or a deputy chief of mission or a deputy assistant secretary of state or an assistant secretary of state. And it's going to take years to repair. And so I hope some of you will think about going into the diplomatic service. I think it's certainly an opportunity now, but it's going to take a number of years to repair a lot of the damage that's been done, and the nation's security will suffer as a result of it. As Secretary Mattis said, if you don't have good diplomats working out there, you're going to need to, give me more money for ammunition.
If I'll just jump in because oftentimes, in retirement, I'm asked by people, well, what do you think is really wrong with the military? And I say, well, my biggest concern is, as Eric pointed out, is with the State Department, because I've seen, as he pointed out, this exodus for one reason or another of what I refer to as the young Turks, the young people that are on the cusp of going to maybe their first ambassadorship, that then, sets the course 10 years from now when you want a seasoned diplomat, where will they be and who will you turn to? Somewhat related, and we discussed this in our report, and it actually drew, a little bit of criticism, is within the Department of Defense itself, that more and more of defense policy, more and more of the thinking and the setting of priorities has really been picked up by the uniformed side of our defense establishment, particularly the Joint Staff. I find that very, very worrying. I really do believe that the strategy, the policy needs to be set by civilian leaders, and that the military is there to execute those plans. Obviously to recommend, offer advice, but we have seen a lot of the emphasis on civilian public servants go away. And I also think that we don't prepare them in the right way. If I'm a young officer, uniformed officer today, I'm going to be sent to a couple of service schools. I'm going to be sent to get a master's degree. I'm going to be put into assignments that take advantage of that. And I believe we should make those same development opportunities available to our young civilians, whether they serve in the State Department or in the Department of Defense. That means, again, you're going to have more people to do functions while others are off in developmental experiences. But I really think, again, this is where we have to look at this. Where have we arrived, and how do we reshape the human capital of our national security establishment? So very important. But I worry about the militarization of policy and strategy within our government.
Thanks, Grace.
Much for responding.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to answer one more question, and it comes from the founder and president of the Hertog Foundation, Roger Hertog himself. So hopefully we can trespass on your time just a moment longer.
I think you're missing my picture, but you're not missing very much. So first of all, thank you for all of us for your gracious efforts here and highly educational and elucidating really many of the big challenges. I have two related questions, but they're the same. I mean, the fundamental issue here is China has become, at least it appears from all the reporting and many of the wisest observers, the real threat to the United States. There are many other threats over years, but this is one that is, I would say, up to the challenge almost of being a true global competitor to the United States. First part of the question is, how'd they get so far? How did this take so long for us to be aware of this? This didn't happen overnight. We have massive business involvements with them, all of our major corporations. They have a giant lobbying effect in the United States. Everybody knows about it. But there haven't been that many books on this subject, haven't been that many educators on this subject, haven't been that many politicians who have ever said anything. And so, without pointing a finger, I'm not talking about it in a partisan way at some politician or another. This has taken a long time in coming. And my related question to it is, which wasn't in your report because it didn't happen, it just happened just a couple of days ago, is this new strategic relationship with China and Iran. And if there was ever a country, I'm talking about China, who has been complicit in nuclear proliferation, whether it's Pakistan or whether it's North Korea, and now we have Iran. Now the whole dimension of this game has fundamentally changed. And so I apologize for, the questions may be a little too long, and I maybe should know better to ask them, but if you could, just give me a chance to understand it better.
Roger, those are both great questions. So let me take a whack at them, and I'm sure Gary will want to chime in and extend and revise my remarks. So on the China, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's taken us quite a while to wake up to the China challenge. And in fact, I mean, there have been voices going back to the late 90s raising questions about China and as a potential threat. And for the longest time, the bulk of China experts, said China's not a threat. China's not a threat. And you now sometimes hear them saying, "Well, China's just too big a threat now. We shouldn't even try and take it on." So there's been a sort of continuum. I think there are a couple of reasons to explain why it happened. One is, if you go back and look at the statements that were made during the Clinton administration about China's accession to the World Trade Organization, to the WTO in 1999-2000, those statements encapsulated a view of the world that was later echoed by my former State Department colleague, Bob Zellick, who in 2005 made a speech talking about China becoming a responsible stakeholder in the international order. And I think there was a very strong disposition to see China as a country that could be brought into the family of nations, could be acculturated, if you would, socialized into agreeing with the so-called Washington Consensus about free markets and open commerce around the world, et cetera, and open societies. And that over time, their association with these institutions would open China up to external forces that would force a political liberalization that had been shut down in 1989 by the events at Tiananmen Square, that would go along with the economic opening that Deng Xiaoping had overseen. and I think they're, including our friend Dr. Kissinger, who I think shared that hope anyway at the time. I think it took a long time for people to come around to see the kind of predatory economic statecraft that China has practiced. I think the lure of profits in the China market was, as you mentioned really in your question, was a very big factor here. And then I say this, as someone who was, partially responsible for this, I think our engagement in the Middle East after 9/11 in Afghanistan, in Iraq, I think, came at a very huge, opportunity cost, which was it delayed recognition of what China was up to. And I mean, that maybe is a good segue into the second half of your question about the China-Iran deal. I think it's very worrisome, including for the proliferation reasons that you mentioned. But I also think there may be within it the seeds of a problem, which is for the Iranian regime, which is this. The Iranian regime is based and premised on a notion that they overthrew a corrupt regime headed by Shah Reza Pahlavi, who sold out the country to the United States and foreign influence. The potential role that China is going to take on in the Iranian economy, I mean, I based on the reports I've seen about what's in this deal, could be very large. And the Chinese presence, for instance, in Africa, which is very large. The Chinese don't make investments where they don't put Chinese managers in, where they don't. I mean, they are very predatory. I think this could breed an enormous backlash in Iran with the Iranian public, which is already very disenchanted with the theocracy. And so I think there may be some unintended consequences here that will, not redound to either the regime's benefit or ultimately to China's. But that's speculation.
Again, great questions. Eric knows the region really well, but I would say that as I look back on it, that I think we believed too much in our own goodness and didn't look hard enough at China's history and its history of empire. I would also say that the other thing that is happening and that led to it, and I use this anecdote often, that in my past life, if there was tension with China and I went to the Hill to talk about why I was concerned about it, I used to tell people I'd be standing in line behind people who were wearing much more expensive suits than I was. Because I think at that period of time, the business interests and the sense of what that market could produce was somewhat intoxicating. I think that has rationalized a little bit, but I tend to agree with Eric. I happen to have had the opportunity to live in Iran for several years. My parents much longer than I. And I think that the Iran that we have seen over the last few decades is not always the same Iran that exists. And so, will the Persian influence emerge and the pride of that country emerge, and will that pose problems for China? But I think, I do believe that we really need to focus a lot more on what's going on in Asia. It's kind of as if the old empires have started to stir again: China, Ottomans, Persians, and Russians. So again, this is why I enjoy engaging with these young people, because they can bring new ideas and thought to it. But Roger, again, thank you for what you do to make all of this possible. And I can't tell you how much I enjoy this engagement. Obviously, it's much more pleasant in person than it is this way, but thank you for what you do.
Yeah, I associate myself totally with my colleagues' remarks.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. Maybe for the next time, really have to ask ourselves the question, which, which in no way is trying to diminish in some way and be political. I'm really not. Is the CIA and our enormous investment in the Central Intelligence Agency up to the task of actually producing this intelligence? Or is it an oxymoron? Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, there have been so many questions like this, and it just, without being, subversive, I always ask myself, it's like one of the most major questions that one could ever have faced in our nation. And for good reasons, Pierre's honest reasons, we now have a major competitor that is able to threaten us on many, many fronts.
From what I've seen, and again, we're all functions of our perspective. And I think that, and the same applies to the military as well, that I think have put a lot of emphasis on people becoming generalists. And I think this is especially true as it applies to the intelligence community. In years past, again, pardon the dinosaur remarks here, but we knew when a screw was turned on a submarine in a shipyard in the Soviet Union. And there were people I could turn to who had done nothing other than study the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet for their entire careers. I can tell you that at least when I stepped off the stage, I could not find people that could give me that same level of intelligence and insight and just sense of what was going on in China or Iran or anywhere else. Eric, you're much more into that world than I am.
No, but I agree totally, Gary. I mean, so the Rob Silberman Commission highlighted this in its retrospective review of the Iraq intelligence failures before the war. We have not made nearly the investment in the study of Mandarin or Arabic or Persian that we did in Russian and in Soviet studies after Sputnik in 1957. I mean, as you know well, Roger, after Sputnik, we passed the National Defense Education Act. A lot of us who were Russia hands were beneficiaries of that. We studied Russian. We got stipends to do it. We had an enormous investment intellectually in understanding the Soviet Union. And even at that, we made major mistakes and got things wrong. But we haven't made a fraction of that investment in China or in the understanding the Islamic world with more granularity. And I think we've paid a price for it. But it's sort of easy to throw my intelligence community colleagues under the bus. But I do have to say that I think more often than not, it's us policymakers who end up screwing things up more than the intelligence community. With specific regard to Iran, I'm partially influenced by the forthcoming book on the rise and fall of the Shah by my occasional co-author Ray Takei at the Council on Foreign Relations, which Yale University Press will publish in, I think, December or January. Ray's study, which relies both on newly available Iranian documents as well as the now available U.S. sources, actually makes a pretty compelling case that the intelligence community's work on Iran was not nearly as bad as people thought it was. It was really more a screw up of policymakers than it was of the intelligence community. So, God knows the intelligence community has its deficiencies, but I think really more often than not, the blame belongs at the doorstep of we, the policymakers.
Thanks for your time again. Mary Elizabeth, it's yours.
Thank you. All right, well, I am going to close this out by thanking you, gentlemen, again, and thanking all of our audience for joining us. So I hope you all have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you very much. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you all.